In this lecture, you will learn how to make an AJAX call to a web API which is residing in a remote web server. We are going to create a web application like this, which will display the information of different countries, and that information will be displayed inside a card like this. This information of different countries are coming from an API. So we are making an AJAX call to an API, and that API is providing us with all these data. And then we are using that data in our web page to display the information like this. The API which we are going to use in this lecture is called as REST Countries API. And this is the documentation of this API. Okay, so I'll share this link, this documentation link in the description box for your reference. So before we make an AJAX call to an API, let's first understand what is an API. An API stands for Application Programming Interface. On a high level, you can say that an API is a piece of software that can be used in order to allow the applications to talk to each other. There can be different types of APIs like DOM API, Geolocation API, and Web API. In this lecture, we are mainly interested in Web APIs. So let's understand API with a very simple example. Here we have the same example which we saw in our previous lecture. We have a simple web page and a server. Now when we click on this button, a request is sent to the server requesting some data. And this server then sends us the response which contains the data which we have requested for. Now this server has something called as API. And it is this API which stores the data which we have requested for. So this API, or you can also call it Web API, this Web API is the one which is providing us the data. And that data which this API provides can be in JSON format or XML format. Once we receive the data from this API, as I said, it can be in JSON format or XML format. Now, to use that data in our web page, first we will have to convert it into a JavaScript object. And once it is converted to JavaScript object, we can use it in our web page. And AJAX will load that data dynamically into the web page. Every API has something called as endpoint where the data is stored. And this endpoint is nothing but the URL or the file location from where we get the data. So this is a brief theory of what is API. Now let's see how to make an AJAX call to a web API. So what we want here is, we want to make an AJAX call to this web API. And this web API then will provide us with the data. Alright, and if you remember, the data is stored at an endpoint. So this API, if we scroll down, has several endpoints. If you want to get the data related to all the countries, then you can use this endpoint. However, I am interested in getting data related to a given country by its name. So I'm going to use this API, this endpoint. Alright. There are other endpoints as well. For example, you can get the country related information based on its full name or code, etc. But I'm interested in getting the country related information by its name. So I'm going to use this endpoint in my project. So the first thing which I have done is I have added a div element in my index.html file with this class countries. And it is this div element inside which we are going to display different country information. And then I have this commented HTML code. And this HTML code is to display a card. Okay, so here in this example, you can see we are displaying the country information inside a card. So this HTML is for displaying a card like this. Now I have commented this because we are not going to use it inside this index.html file. We are going to load this card dynamically from our JavaScript code, and you will see how to do that. All right. And I also have this style.css file, and I have written CSS code to style this card, okay, to look like this. So here we have this CSS code for styling this card. Now let's move to our JavaScript code. And the first thing here which I want to do is I want to get access to this div element. And for that, we can say document dot query selector. And to this, I will pass the class name. And the class name of the div is countries. So let's copy this. Let's go to script.js. Let's use it here. Okay, so it will return us that div element. Let's store it in a variable. Let's call it country list maybe. Okay, so this is here we are getting access to the div element inside which we want to display all these countries, and we're then storing that object in this country list variable. All right, next thing is we want to make an AJAX call, and if you remember, the AJAX call can be made in 3 steps. First step is to create an XML HTTP request object. And to create an XML HTTP request object, we simply say new XML HTTP request object, and it will return us an object. Let's store it in a variable and let's call it request. All right. Second step is to create the request itself. And to create the request, we use open method of this object, this XML HTTP request object. So request dot open. And the first argument of this method is the request type. So we want to get the data from the API, so we will use this get request. And then we have to provide the URL or the file path location, file location from where we want to get the data. And that location is nothing but this endpoint. Okay, so at this endpoint we will get the data. So let's copy this and let's use it here. And I want to get data related to United States of America. So here I will replace this name with USA, right? So here we have created the request. Next we have to send the request. And to send the request, we use send method of this XHR object. So send. Okay, so here we have send the request. Now, when we send the request, the server will send us the response with the data which we have requested for. And that data might take some time in loading. So the next thing which we want to do is, on this request object, we want to add an event listener. Okay, and this event listener will listen for this load event. Okay, and this load event will happen when the data which we have requested is completely loaded in the web page. All right, so it will wait for this load event, and when this load event happens, we want to execute this callback function. And for this callback function, we are going to make use of an anonymous function. All right, so once the data is loaded, the first thing which we want to do is we want to log the data in the developer console to see if we have actually received the data. And from where we get the data? From the response text property of this request object, this XHR object. So request.response text, and it will give us the data which we have received from the server. Let's save these changes. Let's go to our web page. Let's open this developer console. All right, and here we have the data which we have requested. Okay, and this data is in Json string format. All right, so we have this data in a Json string format. So the next thing which we want to do is we first want to convert this Json string into a JavaScript object. And doing that is very simple. All we have to do is we have to use this JSON object, and this JSON object has this pass method. And to this pass method, we will pass this response text. Okay, and it will convert it into a JavaScript object and it will return that. So let's store this returned JavaScript object in a variable and let's call it data. All right. And now let's log this data. Let's save the changes. And here, if you see, we have this object. Okay, so we have converted that JSON string into the JavaScript object. and this object is inside this array. Okay, since we are requesting only one object for USA, we have only one object inside this array. So what I'll do is I will destructure this array and I'll get this object from this array. And to destructure the array, if you remember, we can simply wrap this data variable within square brackets. Now let's save the changes, and now we have this pure object. All right, so here, let me give a comment here. So here we are converting JSON string to a JavaScript object. Okay, so we have the object now, and if you see, this object has several properties, right? So we have borders, area, capital, flag, etc. And we are going to use some of these properties in our project. So the next thing which I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable, and let's call it HTML. Okay, and to this we are going to use this. First, we are going to use this template literal, and inside this template literal we will uh, write an HTML code to display card inside the web page, and inside that card only we want to display all this information, right? And for that I already have this code commented here. So let's copy this code from here and let's use it inside this template literal. All right, and let's replace these values with these properties. So we are getting this object in, we have this object inside this data variable. Okay, so we can use these properties on this data variable. Now the first thing we want is we want a flag image, and you can see we have this flag property here which is pointing to the image of that flag. So here we have the URL for that flag. So let's use this flag property. So inside this source attribute, I'll use dollar symbol, and then inside the curly braces, let's say data dot flag. All right, and it will display the flag inside the card. Next, we want to get the country name. So country name we have this property here. We scroll down, we have this name property, so we can use this name property. Okay, for region, we have region property, so let's use it. And then for population, we have population property. All right, so population. You can check these properties of this object by yourself. I just want to, write these code fast so that we don't spend much time on inspecting each and every property of this object. Okay, so now we have to set the language property. Now for language, if I scroll down, okay, let me expand this object again, and if I scroll down, we have this language property and this languages property, and this languages property is an array. If we expand this array has one element, and this element is nothing but an object, and this object has this name property. Okay, so we want to use this name property here for the language. All right, so for that, first we will have to get the access to this languages array. So languages, and we want to get the first element of this languages array. Okay, so this first element is an object, so it will return us an object, and that object has this name property. All right, so we want to use this name property of this object which is there inside this array. Similarly for currencies, again this currency is an array, so let's expand this. All right, let's expand currencies. Currencies is an array, and this array also has only one element, and this element has again this name property, so we want to use this name property. So let's copy this expression from here. Let's use it here, and let's change the array name from languages to currencies. All right, okay, so finally we want to insert this HTML inside our web page. So for that, let's get access. So we have already written this code to get access to that div element inside which we want to display the country. So let's copy this variable from here, and on this variable we are going to use insert adjacent HTML method. So insert adjacent HTML, and we want to insert it before end, and we want to insert this HTML which we have created. So let's copy this and let's use it here. All right, and that's it. Let's save the changes and let's see if it is displaying the image. So let's close this, and here we have the card which is displaying information related to United States. And from where this information is coming? It is coming from a web API. Okay, and we are using the endpoint of that web API, and we are passing this USA. So here we want to get the information related to USA, so we have passed USA. Now if I pass Germany here, and let's save the changes, this time it should give us information related to Germany. All right, now let's say we want to display information of 3 countries. So instead of writing this code 3 times, what we can do is we can make use of functions, right? So let's copy this complete code from here. Let's remove this complete code from here, and let's create a function, and let's call it get country info. All right, so okay, I've already used function keyword, and this function will take a parameter, and let's call it country, and inside this function we are going to use the code. All right, now the next thing which we have to do is we have to remove this hard-coded value from here, and we want to use this parameter country. Okay, so let's copy this and let's use this value here. All right, now let's save these changes, and let's copy this function name, and let's call this function now. So let's call this function, let's pass USA. All right, let's save the changes, and here we have information of USA. Let's copy this function again and let's call it again, and this time let's pass Germany. Save this, and here we have information related to Germany as well. All right, let's use this again, and let's say maybe Brazil. All right, let's save the changes, and now we should have information of Brazil as well. Okay, now let me make it full screen. So here we have displayed information related to 3 countries, and these informations are coming from a web API. So in this lecture, we have made an AJAX call to a web API to get some information, and then we are using that information in our web page, right? So this is how you can make an AJAX call to a web API using XMLHttpRequest Object. Now in our code, we have made a call to get information related to United States first, and then Germany, and then Brazil, right? But that does not mean this sequence is because of the function calls. You will notice that when I refresh this page, the sequence of how these the information related to these countries are appearing might change. So let me refresh this. So now here Brazil is on the second number. If I refresh the page again, you see the sequence might change in which they are appearing. Okay, so the sequence in which these informations are appearing is not in our hand. Now let's say we want these country information to appear in a specific sequence. So let's say first we want information related to United States, then Germany, then Brazil. Then in order to achieve that, we will have to chain the AJAX calls. And we will talk about it in our next lecture, and there we will also understand what is callback hell. If you like this lecture, like this video, subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends.